think we're actually live, so other people could watch us now, but nobody's going to.
Cool. Okay.
Great. So I would maybe could you start with the origin story of this project and where your background a bit.
Sure. So our team, we are currently 3 developers. We are working from Tampere, Finland, and we have been working on this platform for around 3 years, a bit more than 3 years now. Even though our startup is much younger, the startup was founded last year. And originally, it has been kind of a long and wiggly road, like I think many technology projects are. But originally, we started by to design and develop like a platform or a no-code environment for learning games. So that started because I worked for many years for Finnish education in Finnish education projects where we were developing learning games for different purposes, and one of those. And then there was this kind of a trend emerging that we wanted to make like narrative-driven, sort of like point-and-click adventure games, but with a pedagogical and educational twist. And then the road was, after that, we have been kind of developing this platform, and the definition of what the interactive content actually means, that has been kind of drifting and expanding. So this is basically has been a giant feature creep to the point that the original idea to make it accessible and easy to build interactive content, now the definition of interactive content covers all software essentially. So
Wow, that's funny.
I still feel like we are doing the same project, but as Ville said, the scope has expanded a bit.
Wow. Okay, that's a really interesting origin story. But you're not in the same educational space anymore. Now it's much broader.
Well, that's a funny thing because originally, when we were thinking like we want to enable such that, for example, a teacher on a bus or a train on his or her way to school could use like a platform to build a short story with some educational content and tasks and stuff like that for the students to play once they get when the class starts, or alternatively the students could actually use this platform to create content and in that way learn through building narrative driven stories and so on. And now when basically we experimented a lot with stuff like visual programming languages, and I think Eve, for example, that you have mentioned in your podcast more than once, I guess, did the same thing. They were exploring what does visual programming mean and how it could be used and so on. But we then, like many others before us, and I think many others after us, we ditched the visual programming side and we decided to embrace the code and just try to make coding as simple as possible. And now we are back in the education space, but now from the programming side. So we have been, for example, I have been teaching immigrants and asylum seekers that are coming to Finland for the past 6 months in this kind of a free coding school that I'm running here to build web applications and just by writing code, but still in a educational setting. And we are also collaborating with vocational colleges and actually with one school in Mexico in hopefully in the near future that is going to be happening, where basically the programming basics can be taught using our platform. So previously it was learning pretty much anything through this educational platform. Now it's learning programming through this thing. So yeah,
I see. Cool. So maybe we can dig into the platform now.
Yeah, sure. So I will try and share my screen if I can screen share and share.
Great.
Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Cool. So basically what our platform is doing is removing complexity from software development and especially web application development. And unlike those, like there's a lot of these no-code, low-code platforms out there that essentially are driving some either generating code. So you drag some user interface element to your screen and that will generate some code, or alternatively, they are like model driven that you hook up components together and in the behind the scenes, what you're doing is you are wiring services together. So we took like a different approach to this, and we have been looking at the kind of very fundamentals of what software or web applications are and how they are stored and how they are delivered to user. And one of the things that is kind of very dominant in the software space is to save applications as files. And our platform does not do that. So that means that you cannot use traditional IDEs to create applications because those are basically focused on files. So what our platform is about is, or how you create applications with our platform is through this web-based IDE that is actually developed using itself after a brief bootstrapping phase that we had earlier, and I can guarantee those were terrible times when we tried to get this thing working. But to start with, here you can see the IDE. It's called Zero, for Zero Syntactic Sugar, which we actually have been adding some. But I can start by just making a new project, and it's here, and I can open it. And this is now like the root of our project. So we have a thing called Unified Resource Model, which takes the concept of a file folder and kind of combines it with the concept of a class and an object in a way that all these basic features like classes can have member properties, and you can instantiate objects out from classes, but on the other hand, you can store things inside file folders. All these come together. So this is like the basic root project, root entity, so to speak, of our project. And the way how you show things to users is through what we call lenses. So if I create a lens for this, this is a bit like index HTML. So when you have a web application, the entry point, the server knows sort of the entry point of the application based on the index HTML. So adding this lens property and that pointing to a root demo 1.tsx media creates the same effect. And this is then just simply taking HTML. So I can type hello world. And what we have now done is saved a piece of text into this media here. And I can already open it in a new tab, and this is live. So we just published a website.
Cool.
Then, like I said, now this root here, this entity here is containing the media, and it has a property called lens that is pointing to the media, but I can add some other properties like greetings, and I can say the value of the greetings is 10, and then I can put some curly braces into my text and say focus.greetings times. And if I look at this project again, it actually hot reloads automatically. So
Nice.
now we are nesting this value 10 into our lens. And because it's a lens, obviously the keyword focus means that what is the focus of the lens. So everything that is here, you are accessing through this focus keyword. And I can actually just share this for you into the chat if you're interested in looking how it actually progresses.
Can we edit at the same time?
Yeah, let's actually do an experiment. So I make a button with an on-click event. And I say focus.greetings++. Say hi. So what this is doing is adding 1 to the greetings, and it should auto update on your screen as well. And it also updates on my screen. So you added 5, and if I go and click a few times, I can add a few more.
Cool.
So
yeah, it's quite quick for a multiplayer app.
Yeah, this actually now requires some explanation, like what's going on. So I have actually a slide that I'm going to show in this spot. What we were just doing and what this IDE is doing is not saving, like if we look at this here, this greetings on our IDE says 29 now. And if I go and set it to 100 on the IDE, we can see that it updates to 100 here.
Mm-hmm.
So traditionally, you have this server, like a client-server database architecture, where you have a client application or a web server delivers the user some kind of a client application, and then the client does something. It sends a request or a message to the web server. If the web server needs something from the database, it goes there and fetches it, does some manipulation to it or whatever, and then returns something new to the user. So we are kind of swapping the place of the web server and the database. So instead of storing software as files and state as some kind of database entries or whatever, we are storing applications as series of events. So just a bit like essentially event sourcing that covers not only the application state, but the application itself. And what this IDE is actually doing when we develop the application is emitting events to a database or a list called partition. Each one of these root projects here is essentially called partition, which means it's a list of events. And these are stored in the cloud in a thing called the authority, which is basically just event broker task to store and validate and distribute event streams. Then in the browser, there is a library called Gateway, which is an open source library that we are building and which is kind of the core and heart of this whole system, which is capable of subscribing to event streams and reducing the application state out from that event stream. And once that gateway has done that, it renders a functional view of the application to the user. So what we are seeing here is the rendering of the final state of that event stream. At the same time, it includes, or how to say, integrates these things called Valaa script functions to the user interface, which are capable of creating transactions that describe the creation and deletion and modification of these resources back to the gateway. And when I click this button hi, that's exactly what's happening. It's saying that the greetings properties new value is one more than it was previously. This gateway will instantly return a new rendered view to the user. But if this transaction is affecting other resources somewhere in the cloud, it's sending that as a command to the authority, which validates the event. So it checks it's made by a right person that has permissions to do that, and it's in a kind of a logical order in relation to other events. And if it passes the validation, it sends it back to the gateway. And if this gateway was the original creator, nothing basically happens other than it's checked as something that the authority has validated. But in other cases, if it's, for example, if you are looking at the application right now, and I'm clicking this here, the reason why you are seeing that number getting bigger is that your gateway is subscribing to the same event stream. And when the new event comes, it just applies it on top of the previous state and then renders you a view. So that's kind of in a nutshell what's going on here.
Cool. That makes sense.
And that's kind of like this is called distributed event sourcing, because obviously it's not just one list, but it's multiple lists that are interacting with each other. So or the single application can be composed out of multiples of these lists, and these events can be sent to different places. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Do you would now be a good time for questions, or do you want to keep going with an example?
Yeah, I think a question or two would help us kind of like find the next direction where to go.
Great. So in the simple case of a number and increasing the number, I feel like it has a name. It's like monotonically increasing. So it doesn't matter what order in which the buttons are pressed. If I press the button 10 times, you press the button 10 times, as long as it says 20 at the end of the day, we're fine. But there are cases in which ordering matters. And so I'm wondering if you expose like those low-level constraints, those low-level details to the programmer so they can program that nuance in when the ordering matters.
I can take this one. So effectively, whenever a client gateway is sending an event to the authority, the sent event also contains the previous event index, so that if everything goes fine and there's no other incoming events from other clients, then nothing needs to be happening. The authority knows that the previous state of the client was the actual truth, and then it'll just accept it. But now, if the situation is that two clients are writing events at the same time to the same authority, then the backend, the authority picks one of those events and bounces the other event back to the client. And then what the client gateway does is that it receives this bounce, and then it purges the existing state and reforms the whole event log, all the purged events, and tries to reapply the event that it had earlier sent. And now it depends on the problem, or it depends on the application, how the reapplication of the events or the reforming of the events is done. Right now, we only have naive solutions, so that if two people click the increment by one button at the exact same time, the increment by one is actually just it's very client side. It just reads the previous and sets the value to a new value, and the reapplication at the moment will just drop some of those increments, because we don't have the more complex logic. But eventually, because the conflict resolution, the reformation of the events is done on the client side, the computation is very close to the user and very close to the application. So we have full freedom to perform any kind of conflict resolution logic we need to. So adding increment logic is easy once we need that, but we can also have very complex logic, like if two people are clicking +1 and there's a constraint like this number cannot increase over 200 or it's a failure, then we can have our application programmers program those kind of constraints in it, so that the backend doesn't naively just increment it over 200 to 201, but the client is free to kind of determine the conflicts. So the conflict resolution happens on the client side. So even arbitrarily complex scenarios can be eventually solved by our application programmers.
Okay. So sorry, I just want to go over that one more time. So when you say the conflict resolution happens on the client side, you
Yes.
mean that the client side is given access to like a failed transaction, like you tried to do this thing, it didn't work, and then it gets to decide what to do about it?
Yes, exactly. The transaction is there are backend transactions, but if even one of the events in the transaction has been obsoleted, if even one of the partitions in that transaction has got a new events in the meantime, then the whole transaction is re-rolled back, and the client has to kind of do it again. So
and the client's informed of the re-roll, so and with all the data, it's
yes.
Like you sent this is what happened in the meantime, and then
exactly.
it could display whatever. And
Yeah,
so in this example, like looking back at the code, would I wrap this focus greetings ++ in like a try catch loop?
Maybe. We haven't gotten that far yet, because we are developing very kind of use case focused. So once we start arriving at those cases, then we'll be adding that kind of functionality, more complex functionality. Right now, our system is basically just validating structural conflicts. If I'm trying to modify a resource that someone else destroyed, for example, then it will abort the whole transaction. But otherwise, setting integer values, setting string values, we are just overwriting them at the moment. But for your question on what kind of opportunities we have for adding that conflict resolution for our developers, one of the alternatives is indeed an exception, throwing an exception. Another alternative is using the gateway API function calls. We can expose the transaction object through API calls to the developer, and the developer can attach constraints or reapplication or conflict resolvers to the transaction itself, and then those will be called back by the transaction conflict resolution logic and so on. So it depends on our first real world use cases. We will be experimenting what is the most natural way of doing that conflict resolution, and moving onwards from there. But in the end, because the conflict resolution happens close to the user and close to the developer, I'm fully confident that, I mean, let's put it this way. It's kind of a mathematician approach. I know there's a solution for this, because it's conceptually easy to do. on the client side. When we allow the developers to write their custom logic, we just haven't experimented with that part so much yet.
I see. Cool.
I think to give a bit more context, I could make a slightly more complex or extend this demo a bit more.
Okay,
Because,
great.
Because can you, Iridium? Mute?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. So this basic event sourcing system that we saw here happening, this is kind of like the first of a few different, so to speak, layers of things that we try to use to make application developers' life a bit easier. So the second layer on top of this event sourcing that allows this cross user collaboration and these instant updates and all that is a thing called unified resource model, which has some very kind of wild instancing mechanisms and stuff like that. So the Valaa's resources come in 3 different flavors. First is the entity, which is representing file folders and classes and objects and so on. Then there's the media. So this media itself is also a resource that can contain other resources, have properties and stuff like that. But on top of that, referencing a binary data object in the cloud. So this is kind of like, how to say, secondary information almost. I don't know if that's the correct word, but it's not like the first class citizen, the content of the file.
I see.
And the third thing is a third resource is called relation, which essentially does all the same things as entities and medias, meaning that they can contain other resources and they can be instantiated and so on, but they can also reference to another resource. And I just created this new relation, and I named it task, because what is the better thing to do than a to-do list to demonstrate something. So I will give this task a couple properties. First property would be done, and I will set the value of the done to be false. And then I will do another property, which I just called to do, and that is something that we are going to store the what is supposed to be done text it. And next I will just quickly write an input box. So input type text on key up with an on key up function, and so this is supposed to make box, yeah. And here we want to test if we are pressing enter. So that this only happens when we hit enter. And then we just say new focus.task. And say the owner is focus, the name is task with capital letters, and the properties are to do is e.target.value, meaning the text from the text box, and then we set it to null. And now make an to do app put. If I type this is supposed to give me an error, because properties. You can see the error messages are actually coming to the UI, and when you fix the error goes away. So make an to-do app. Okay, the text disappeared, and we have an instance of the task here, which this symbol is meaning that the task relation is a prototype, meaning that something is inheriting inheriting that, and this symbol here says that this is an instance, so it inherits state from a prototype. And yeah, so now we have made the first task. So now there's task, and that would just appear here as a new task. Now there's this. When we were first setting this project up and looking at it, we had this lens that was pointing to a media. And the lens is a part of a thing called Valaa scope. So it's kind of illustrated on our website with this telescope-looking contraption. The idea is that these resources are somewhere in the cloud, and you are always looking at them through a component called Valaa scope that has a few features. First of all, it has a lens that describes how those resources are looking like, and then it has a focus, so exactly where is the Valaa scope pointed at. So I can look at these, I can create a new Valaa scope to look at these resources just by typing Valaa scope. And if I wanted to, I could say focus equals focus dot $v dot. So here I'm getting all the relations with the name task, and I'm getting the first of those into this this Valaa scope, and I type make a list item with the focus to do, and this should have make a to do app. Yes. So, but instead of using focus, I can also type array and get that 0 out. And now we should have a list of all the tasks we did. So new tasks are shown in the screen automatically. And we can also, now inside this Valaa scope, the focus is new element, because this Valaa scope array is going through each one of these tasks one by one and looking at them. It's just like a telescope arrays, but so basically it's looking at different resources and creating many Valaa scopes which each have a new focus. So now if we type here focus.todo, it's rendering this make and to do app text because the focus is task. So focus.todo is this string here. And then we can make a function here saying focus.done equals exclamation mark focus done. So now clicking this first task should set the first task as done. And to make it a bit more visual, we can apply some CSS and say text decoration equals focus.done. So now we can mark out all these tasks as done. Yeah, so here you can see that these all these tasks are saved in this particular partition, but you could also save them into another partition if you wanted, so that they wouldn't just pollute your root application or anything. But the interesting thing here is that if I just decide to add, let's say, every task would have some attachments. So let's add an entity called attachments and give it that an accessor property. Now every task has an entity inside, so they are still continuously inheriting the changes from this original task.
Cool. Yeah, very fun. I haven't seen a to-do MVC demo like that ever.
Yeah, I made some benchmarks for how much does it actually take to make a to-do MVC with different, this todomvc.org, I think, the website, or .com, that lists like how to make a to-do app with the exact same features with like a zillion different technologies.
Yes, I'm very familiar.
So I made this analysis on the lines of code that each one of those is the different technologies. I dropped some of them from the in between, but I was capable of getting that exact to-do MVC done with 47 lines.
Can I see it? I find that hard to believe. That's not very many lines.
I mean, I can. I'm not actually quite sure where it is now.
Well,
but
that's fine. I guess I know it pretty well, so I can just ask you about the thing. One of the things that makes to-do MVC hard is deleting to-dos. So I'd be curious to know how you do that.
Sure. So
okay, sure. That works. All right, easy.
Yeah, that's just like new event on top of the previous list describing that. Okay, that is now destroyed. So like I had in this list, like transactions for creating, deleting, or modifying malicious resources.
Yep. So let's dig into this lens thing, because it seems like it's quite essential, but it's also it seems unique. Is it similar to things I've seen in other languages, or is it pretty unique?
It's let's say I think Iridian could perhaps comment on that.
Yeah. Okay, so the lens as a concept is just our own brand of the traditional model view controller system. So we have our own syntax for it. We are borrowing the VSX from React to some point. But in its core, it's just the view and the controller combined together with the live updating event source backed update model on the user interface side. But the syntax is borrowed from VSX. The concept is age old. Just view controller is the lens itself, and the model is the focus of the lens itself. So conceptually, I don't think it's new. It's just how we do it is in some ways novel.
I see. So one thing that seems a little bit confusing to me is all the way on the left of the code. in the navigator, there's that lens line. I'm not sure what that represents. Can we have another lens in that tree?
Yeah. So these, Iridium, can you mute?
Sorry.
Thanks. So this lens is just essentially a property that is just like this greetings is a property. And this task here, you can see this tiny blue arrow. If I click this accessor properties collapsed button, it's just task pointing to a task property pointing to a task relation. So essentially what the Valaa scope is doing, so if I make a new Valaa scope here, and I say that focus is hello new Valaa scope. And inside here I make an H1 that renders the focus. It should say hello new Valaa scope. So this Valaa scope has one of the initial properties of one of the features that it has is the focus. The second one is a lens. So I can make new media here. Large text.vsx, let's call it that, and I can add it here and just say H1 with the style size being 30px, and it just renders the focus one, and now I can add this as a lens for it. So I can say use focus.large text. So now we should have a, so I can
it changed.
yeah, that's okay. Now it actually works. Yeah. So now it's using this. So yeah, it's just rendering this focus, which in this case is just a string, using this lens called large text. I can even show them here. You can see these things on. You can look at this and look at this through different lenses you are having. So
Oh, okay.
look
Hold
at
on.
it through the normal lens and the large lens and so on.
The large. Oh, sorry, can you click on the other lenses? This is cool.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's an overview default lens, which is basically, like I mentioned in the beginning, it's like the index. So you tell to the platform or the initial Valaa scope, or if it's not the initial Valaa scope, but it's just a Valaa scope that you set up, like here, you can tell it that use this lens. But if it doesn't have a lens, then it will try to derive the lens from looking at property named lens from the focus and use that instead. So what you see here is just like all the properties from this list that are pointing at media. Yeah.
I think I see. So lens right now is pointing to demo1.vsx, and so that
Yes.
so this is the lens, or
Yes.
and I could just think in my mind it's like the view, the HTML, the view.
But then if I render this large text, what it does actually is takes this thing and between these two curly braces renders this root demo with the root demo1.vsx lens, because this basically jumps here. So if I would say focus.greetings, and I looked at this, it just says 108 hello there because it's rendering this one. But now it just goes back to this focus and tries to render the whole thing, but it doesn't find a lens, so it's using the default lens, and thus everything here is inside one gigantic H1.
I see. Okay. Cool.
So then there's one more, like there's one more feature. So like I said, the focus just creates, if you have a Valaa scope that has a focus, it just sets one Valaa scope up that is looking at that data. So here we are using this hello new Valaa scope through this particular lens. I just get this out and make it a bit more visual. But the alternative to that is obviously like we are doing here. We are describing the lens on this from line 24 to 28. We are describing the lens here, which is another alternative, but we could actually just do like this and drop what we just wrote in between, and it still works.
Sorry, let me see that again.
So you either describe the lens inside, essentially.
Yep.
Between the two Valaa scope.
Or you just refer to the lens as a property.
Or you refer to a lens, yeah.
I see.
But another thing you can do is to change this into an array. So now this takes an array of values.
Yeah, it'll print them out as separate H1s.
Yeah. And finally, there's a thing called context. So you can just make something like foo equals bar. And now inside this lens, I can type just foo, and this should add bar after each one of these. So this is rather powerful gadget that all is basically centered around. So the first thing you see, or the initial Valaa scope when you open an URL, this URL, this is kind of like our own schema that Iridian can explain a bit more in a moment. But this is like an HTTP client responsible for serving you this gateway component, which is a front-end JavaScript library. And then this partition here is using our own URN schema to locate the event stream and subscribe to that and reel it in and show it to the user. And the first Valaa scope is set up automatically, and then every other like follow-up Valaa scope you want to use for your application, you can set up yourself.
Okay. So there are two questions that come to mind. I don't know how they're kind of related. One is so this is very global data, but you kind of alluded to how you could scope it down. Like if I wanted to do a list that only I can see, I guess you have users and logins and all that complicated stuff. I'd be curious how you make it not global. That's like one question.
Oh yeah. So for that, that's a very good question. So if I just now open this into an incognito window and start clicking, obviously this is super not useful in the long term. If you wanted to make a website that collectively the entire universe and can only be on one website at a time. But there's a thing called frame, which is yet another feature of the Valaa scope. So let's just use this as an example. I make a new entity called client, and I add a lens for it, and I add a property like my private value. Set that to 100. And unfortunately, I am now introducing a new concept entirely called an instance lens. So you can also just insert these elements like this to your files or to your project by, I can say here, my private value is focus of my value. Oops. Okay. So now my private value is 100. And if I go in here and I add a button that adds 1 to it, this still does the same thing. So you will see my value incrementing as well, because the focus is kind of pointing at the cloud, to the cloud resource. But if I change this focus into frame, which essentially is trying to refer to this metal tube on your Valaa scope, the frame of the Valaa scope. Now if I add
you have to put frame instead of focus above?
Yeah.
Okay.
So now this one has a different frame. So.
And what happens when you refresh the page?
Then you get that value is lost.
Okay. Frame is local, is very local.
Yeah. But then there's there's a lot of then there's a concept called local instance which is persisted in the index DB, so that will survive your refresh. Then there are personal partitions, so I could just go and I guess you will crash if you don't close the page now for a second.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me find that page. Okay, it's closed.
Yeah. Okay. So I can. This actually has a bunch of logic in it, but a login system which I can now log in, and now in here I can say just h1 hello active user handle. Hello, Ville Ilkkala. And now I have kind of an app data partition as well. So this created me logging in first time to this application, create like my private partition that has content only for me, which I can access by, let's say I want to make a button on click which says
I'm curious about how you'd make the to-do list scoped to just the current user.
Oh, okay. Well, that's very easy. I can just let me make sure that my user app data is loaded. You can just looking at things will load them. So basically, the fact that I used Valaa scope to look at something, that made it to activate, so to speak. But now, instead of saying owner is focus, I can say that the owner is user app data, and I can go and get these from the user app data instead. So my, oops, I'm missing a $V. I will get rid of some of this junk for a moment because this gets very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So now these are actually going into my user app data entity that I can access only from my, like it's personal to me.
And can the application programmer see other people's data?
Depends on the case, but usually no. Usually the login system essentially matches a thing called application identity. So here's few things that are hidden. If I toggle this here, we have a thing called identity here. So the identity is basically just a pointer to a partition or a relation to a partition, and the login system matches the user and the application identity to fit is the application data of the user. So in that sense, it's not supposed to be accessible unless the application developer by the application developer, unless the application developer makes it explicit that are going to give access to this. If I made any sense.
Yeah. And what about like more nuanced ownership, like the data is readable by everyone, but only writable by certain people?
Yeah, it's done by this permissions relation here. So it has read and write and other roles that are then pointing to my public user identity. The fact that the application has a permissions relation pointing to my user allows this to happen, but this is still slightly work in progress, this permission system, and it's not like it's not yet very operational, but that's how it's going to be working.
Got it. Another thing that just came to mind, you might not have an interesting answer yet, is how does this play well with like offline and offline? It seems very tied to you having an internet connection. So have you thought about offline?
That has been one of the design principles early on with the event sourcing, that the gateway is capable of just dropping out from the internet and stacking and queuing up the events and making it so that the application, obviously I cannot demonstrate this happening because otherwise we would drop off the call as well, but but every time you can see, every time I do something with this application, let's say I change this, keep your eyes on the left bottom corner of the screen. There's this saving data. That was the event going out and being returned back as valid. If you drop out of the internet, you can continue just developing or using the app, and it will stack up these events, and the number will go up that you have 500 events in a queue. And then when you get back online, it will connect to the partition, and hopefully there are no conflicts, so that it can just upload the event chain to the list.
I see. I guess another related question is, I feel like what you guys are doing is like kind of pretend. I don't know about pretending, but you're treating variables in the cloud as if they're almost local variables, which makes them really easy to use. But I guess that simplification, I'm wondering what would happen. There are some times when things just take time, and like you need to show a loading icon or something, and I'm wondering how you would how that would appear in the programming model. Did the question come across, or do you want me to try asking it another way?
Yeah, I think. Well. What? Okay, Iridian has some.
Right. So I'm not sure if Ville can demonstrate it by heart, but Ilari, our other developer, is using heavily these lens roles. Our Valaa scopes, in addition to the array and focus and lens and the context property, they have these lens roles that can be used to kind of add alternative lenses for loading time behavior, for error behavior, and so that if the lens contents are faulty or not loaded or corrupted or whatever, we can attach individual lenses to these individual cases. And this mechanism can also be used to implement kind of pending resources. So if we are talking to JavaScript audience, we can create promises inside our lenses and return those. And then if the promise hasn't resolved yet, the Valaa scope object will render a pending lens, waiting for resources pending lens instead of the main lens for the duration until the promise actually resolves. So this way, the application programmer, admittedly, promises are a bit more advanced concept, but if we are talking about experienced programmers, they have full control over the lifetime issues as well. And as we talked about the transactions and the conflicts and how to introspect those and how to resolve conflicts, and so the similar mechanisms we will have, the similar kind of mechanisms will be used or will be available for our developers to kind of attach pending behavior to transactions which have not yet been confirmed as truths. So that our basic approach is that we render everything immediately to the user as kind of optimistic data, optimistic rendering. But if the application developer actually wants to make sure that the user only gets a view that's a truth, then they can go through a bit of extra loops and attach those callbacks so that there's actually a pending lens being rendered until the event has been confirmed as a truth.
Yeah, cool. That makes sense.
And for the Iridian.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, for the you can do like inside these functions. You can do very basic, like you can use all these, like this. I might have like misunderstood your question in some ways, but you can do this kind of transient computing and only kind of commit as transactions the modifications you do relevant in some ways. So you can use const and you can use let and do all this type of stuff inside the function, and then these actual like resources in the cloud or in the local instance or something like that. Only those are then actually created as events.
Well, I guess, you're helping me ask the question. So when you call new focus.task, does that return a promise that I can then call .then on?
Actually, this return, if I just store this to focus and say that focus.latest equals new this, and I will get these from focus again. So it just added this latest property into the root, and that points to the latest task. So if I do some other task, this task is now this latest one.
Answer to your specific question, the new focus.task doesn't return a promise. It returns a reference to a new resource immediately. So it doesn't wait. It's optimistic just as well. But all the computation or all the operations are in a single function call get put into the same transaction. So even if you make deeply nested function calls which manipulate Valaa resources and all of that, all of those events get placed into the same transaction. So if the transaction fails, all those side effects are discarded. So once we add the transaction introspection APIs and the waiting functionalities, the idea is that the developer attaches these hooks and promises to the transaction object itself, and not fine-grained on the resources. But also, there will be also APIs for kind of segmenting the single nested function call system, so that you can designate that this particular subcall is a transaction of its own, and it has this promise, or you can attach it or get a promise out of it that will resolve only when the whole sub-transaction gets resolved, and so on. But the resource, the individual operations themselves don't return promises by default.
So, hello?
Are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I think my internet just cut out and then came back on.
Okay.
For no reason.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So
I wanted to show you some.
I just had one last clarifying question about the last thing. I was wondering where where transactions begin and end. Like, for example, in this key up new task, this is just one transaction. If we created two tasks like back to back, would that be two transactions or just one transaction because it's in the same function?
Right. So the transaction gets initiated by the root call from the UI. So when the user clicks a button, that creates a new transaction, and the transaction gets committed only when the whole function call chain comes back out. So that if our on-click handler would create several tasks, they would call, all of those would go to the same transaction.
Okay.
And if they wanted to isolate, they could say new promise, blah, 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 blah. And because the new promise itself gets returned out, then the contents of the callbacks of those promises would have their own transactions in that case. So it's basically every synchronous nested function call chain or tree is one transaction, and creating new transactions is you create new top-level function call chains, which can be run done by promises or by user interface actions and so on.
I see. Thank you.
Okay, I want to make another kind of, or give you another tiny demo, which is kind of, actually, are you able to see the application anymore? Did you log out or did you close?
I can, here, I reopened it.
You are supposed to see the login screen, but I think you can log in as a guest to the application.
I don't see a login screen. I just see the app as it was with the blue stuff and the high 10 bar, high bar, cool bar, 100 bar.
I think you might. What does it say here? Hello.
Oh, here, it just says my private value is 103. So I'll refresh the page maybe.
Yeah, try that.
Page unresponsive. Okay, so I'll close it and open it again. Okay. It gave me an error. Oh, there we go. Log in as new guest. Hello, guest user 2.
Okay. Yep. So now you can again follow what I'm doing. We have been kind of experimenting with different kind of approaches or features that we could bring into this IDE to make the life of some of, for example, students easier.
Okay.
Using like want to integrate some data or something like that. And one of these is a thing called Expander, which is just one of these buttons here, the second button. And we have our first kind of a pilot expander, which is essentially a proxy from some existing data set or API into the Valaa platform in a much more accessible way. So this particular API is the CO2 emissions from the Finnish Helsinki, the capital region, from 1990 and from 2000 to 2015. And you can essentially just click use this API. And now if I make an UL Valaa scope array, it's one yeah. So now there's the CO2 emissions of Helsinki capital region by the year as a list. I don't know if you have it or do you have the error?
I have the error, but I could refresh the page as well.
Okay.
Yep, I have it now.
So this is something that we piloted with some 9th grade students some time ago, and they really kind of enjoyed. They made this kind of a climate change based school project over the course of 3 days, and we added this API so that they could actually practice web programming together with talking about climate change. And you can do kind of cool things. Let's one more style background.
And then in order to change the text file, you're hitting like Control S.
I'm just defocusing or defocusing or hitting S or anything.
Okay. Oh, so how did you do the different sizes?
I just added the width to be the value plus px.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And this one is also cool. Helsinki, Vantaa, Espoo. These are the 3 cities from the capital region. Helsinki, Vantaa, and Espoo. And so now I have to use context here because if I'm modifying the root object, the focus is no longer there. So if I want to change something like city, so if I add a new property here called city, and let's call that Helsinki. Now I store the focus in this context with the keyword origin, and now I can, inside this Valaa scope, I can change it and then just add focus.city. So now we should be able to change which city you are looking at.
Hold on, and it changes it for me too.
Yeah, because I'm editing the global state. I'm not using the local state.
You're not using. You could use frame, and then it would be independent.
Yeah.
I don't entirely get why you needed origin. Why couldn't you just put focus.city?
Because the focus is Helsinki, then Vantaa, and then Espoo, the string.
I see.
So inside here, the focus is no longer this app, but it's basically this piece of data here.
I see. Makes sense.
We have some cool animations and stuff like that. People like this.
Neat. This feels. I feel like it's a combination of like an online editor, kind of like Glitch, and then also Firebase.
Yeah. I think like we did some mapping like between this Glitch and Revolut and those type of things. We call them kind of deployment innovations. That basically what you do in Glitch, you have your index.html and you have all these files and everything that is required for your project using kind of the standard state-of-the-art development tools. You can use React and whatever you want. So that's Glitch isn't exactly changing how code is written. It just makes all the surrounding fuzz go away, all the webpack and stuff like that. And then there are like development innovations that are working on how code is written. So for example, Flutter could be one of those
Which one?
ideas. Flutter, the Google's app building language / platform for Kotlin.
Oh, I don't know that. Cool.
So those are kind of like the two things that are coming together in what we are trying to bring together is that we actually created this VSX is very much, it feels like a bit of like JSX, but it's very much like built from the ground up. Then all this code that we are writing, it's kind of like a dialect of JavaScript. Instead of being pure JavaScript, we have Iridian can explain stuff about all those interpreters and stuff that he has built on top of JavaScript to run this code. So we are kind of trying to bring those two things together and then combine it also with the protocol level innovations that is kind of like focusing on how code is stored and distributed. So you can think about something like Ethereum smart contracts is a new way of storing code. So this is doing a bit of the same thing and trying to bring all these three kind of areas together.
Yeah, well, I guess, do you guys have version control stuff for this too? I'm wondering.
That's a thing in the that we're still working on, but not yet exactly version control. We have ways that we manage creating copies, and we can do instancing and stuff like that. Iridian perhaps could explain his kind of short and longer term vision on version control.
Okay.
Right. So basically, the version control is probably the biggest sore point we have. The event sourcing system, our kind of unified object model, because it changed the file architectures rather radically. It means that it's difficult for us to reuse existing version control solutions. So that's basically a long-term development project, and we have to kind of invent everything from the step zero. Given that we have several ideas on how to approach it. Some of them involve instancing, because Ville touched briefly instancing in a couple of different places, but it's not very obvious. When we created those tasks in the example, those are instances. We can take instances of the whole applications, for example. And our first, the problem of local changes only, our first solutions for that were basically take an instance of the whole application for the users on the as user local instances, and then all changes were local to that. And this instancing system can also adapt it to some types of version control solutions. Essentially, we could have it so that during development, user creates an application and object inside it, makes a release, and then makes an instance of that release and starts developing that one for onwards, because the new changes on top of the new instance are local to that instance only. The original application doesn't get changed, but the instancing system is basically, there's still the continuity. So you could basically go on creating instance change and so on. So this would be one approach. The problem would be then merging two different branches and so on. So that would be a new avenue of research. So right now we are relying very heavily on the collaborative editing aspect of the whole system, so that our short-term plan is to rely on the fact that editing here is very real time. It's more like editing the same Google Docs at the same time. Our system is created to be robust enough so that if someone breaks some part of the application, it stays local. It doesn't actually break anything completely. It's not a crash to desktop or anything like that. So that multiple people can work on the same partition at the same time. And even if you make issues on your own stuff, you don't actually outright break everything else. So on the short term and on small and to medium projects, we are relying on the Google Docs style of collaborative editing. On longer term, there will be publishing mechanisms where you can actually make releases of applications and of designs. I mean, you can make releases of single partitions, and you can make releases of enterprise partition collections. and have versioning for them. But well, yeah, it's a field where we need to do a lot of research on what will be the most natural ways of doing that.
Yeah, it's a tough problem. The way you've combined code and data makes it tricky.
Yeah, we have powerful tools, but the tools are different from anything that exist previously. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Is there other things you want to talk about, or I'm trying to think if there are other things, other directions we should go in.
I think we have covered. I can actually just show you an actual thing that is built with this. So that kind of this is using the loading lens thing. So this is basically it's kind of like a business matchmaking tool for the Tampere region. It's still in beta and it hasn't been really released much to the outside, but you can log in just the way you logged in to your previous application. I was already logged in, and then you can see your matching percentage against either individuals or organizations or events, and you can act as a different organization, or you can create new organizations, events, and services. You can edit your tags. What are your interests? You can change your profile pictures. You can hide your profile. You can edit your contact details and do all that sort of basic stuff. So this is kind of like an actual use case and application that was built. And just to come into this slide back again, this is, I made a rough estimation or calculation. This whole thing, if not counting for the CSS, is around 900 lines of code.
Wow.
So it's up here with the vanilla JavaScript to do MVC. So it's
impressive.
Yeah.
I always tell Ville that counting on the number of lines in the code is slightly misleading, because we are actually offloading so much of the application and the application structure away from the files into this object model. As Ville mentioned, the entity is not just a file folder, but it's actually a class and an object and all of that. So it reduces the pressure from having to describe classes in files, and it reduces a lot of boilerplate. So it's not a fully it's not an outright lie, or it's not a lie at all that we can do a lot with way much less. But I would basically say that if we take an intellectually honest estimation, then maybe our line codes would be approximately double. A comparable application, a comparable line count would be a double of what we have, and that still would basically be less than our competing solutions. So that when Ville says that there's 900 lines of codes in this matchmaking application, there are still a lot of multiple partitions, and if you click open all the objects, there's maybe like 400 lines of objects, and
I see.
So.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But still.
Yes, but still.
It's a huge reduction, and I think, yeah.
So,
from the learning standpoint, like we just a new group started studying. Actually, that's a project I can demo. Just a second, I think here. So I have Iridian. Could you thanks. Okay, this is errors out. So I think I. Let me try again.
I was going to ask, as a startup, I'd be curious to know what phase you're in. It sounds like you guys raised some money a year ago, and like, how'd you like? Are you looking for customers? Do you have customers? I'm just curious to get a sense of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we are currently raising, and we also are currently engaged in some customer projects already. So we are starting few things, but it has been a curvy road so far, and especially as Europe is not as how to say brave in these types of deep tech ideas. So it hasn't been that super easy to raise funding, but we are still in the seed phase, even though we have been like working with the variable team size on the open source core for many years. So
cool.
But yeah, now I got this thing working. So essentially, this is an internship, or this is like for vocational colleges. They have a set of requirements based in the curriculum, what they need to kind of accomplish. And I have a couple students we have a couple students as interns from the Tampere Vocational College studying media. Studying programming. So we decided to make this kind of like a management tool for them to see that how all the different requirements in their student curriculum are actually met and fulfilled within their internship with us. So you can select your degree, and then you can start filling this out, and you can toggle these different kind of requirements you have on and off, and so on. So this is very much like a relational database. It has degrees here and categories, and are you there?
Sorry about that.
So this is kind of a complex system already in a sense that these degrees have different categories of study, and the different categories have requirements, and the requirements have sub-requirements, and the sub-requirements can have further sub-requirements and all sorts of stuff and so on.
And so is this, I would assume that it's like an object MongoDB kind of data store. Is that right?
No, I mean, it's basically, this is just it. This is the using the same principles as we did with the task, but instead these are just deeper structures that have these entities and medias and stuff like that. So each one of these requirements can have attachments and reports and stuff like that.
And so if I wanted to query these things, or if I wanted to, like, it's not as a SQL database where I can write a query. I have to go through it in the nested structure to get at what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
To me, this like evokes like a MongoDB style document store, JSON store. that's like nested in structure. You can't it's like not a normalized thing that I can query with SQL.
Right. Okay. So we don't have a database store at all in the traditional sense. It's all events. The only thing that gets stored is those change events, and then the client gateways, they just recreate the application based on those change events that are coming from the backend. There are performance optimizations, snapshots, so that the event logs, huge event logs, don't become a performance issue. But essentially, it's just events.
Oh, I see. Okay.
There are the binaries, the code files and so on. They are of course binaries because that's a more optimal way to store those. But the data model themselves, it's an in-memory. It's basically the events are the things that go to the internet, and the actual objects are in-memory objects. And the partition system, the distributed event system, and the partitions make sure that only a controlled amount of partitions is loaded in the memory at the same time, so that we don't run out of memory when our ecosystem gets big.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'll have to be leaving now.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure. I enjoy watching Ville's presentations. It's been a while since I watched this the last time, and I'm very happy to get these more in-depth technical questions. It's always a pleasure because I feel like that's our most impressive things are, well, not most, but there are impressive things under the surface as well. The thing on the surface looks easy, but some of the things like magicians, the most easiest looking things are often the hardest. You went into the transactions, which I really like, because the transaction system is probably the most complex thing under the surface. The bridging the gap from the front end code and the Valaa script code into the event streams. So I was happy to answer the questions relating to those. But now I have to leave. Thank you, and bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya.
All right.
I'm still here, but I think we should start wrapping up.
Sounds great.
It will take at least like a century for you to write the transcript.
Yes. Well, yes. Thanks so much for your time. This was very fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise, it was a pleasure.
Alrighty, I'll hit the stop button.